The Minnesota Vikings have had quite the offseason so far, with a lot of good moves, but also losing a couple of key pieces. So in today's video, I want to talk about the Minnesota Vikings and why I personally believe the Minnesota Vikings are ready to win right now. Subscribe if you're new, let's hop into it. So I think the best way to start off this video is by talking about what they've done so far in free agency and what their current roster looks like before we start talking about the future. As you can see, this is all the moves they've made so far this offseason, signing guys like Will Fries, Jonathan Allen, Ryan Kelly, bringing in Isaiah Rodgers, Okuda, and a handful of other players. And then they also traded for Jordan Mason, which we'll talk about here in a second, as well as re-sign a couple players, but they've also lost a few players as well. So nowadays, when we look at their current depth chart, I look at it and I think it is really solid. We'll start off with the offensive side of things because this has been a bit of a different unit this year. We'll start off with the JJ McCarthy conversation because that's, of course, the biggest change from last year to this year. Of course, last year Sam Darnold was there, and Sam Darnold had an awesome year. Now, it didn't end perfectly, but I think we can all admit that he probably played better than almost every single one of us could have ever expected. And that's really good news for the Minnesota Vikings because they were able to get that out of Sam Darnold, and I personally believe they could potentially get even more out of a guy in JJ McCarthy. Now, we only saw JJ for I think one game in preseason, and in that one game, he looked fantastic. It was just, of course, a very small sample size, so we really don't know what to expect from him this upcoming season, coming off a major injury like he did. The good news is his game isn't really predicated on athleticism. Yes, that is a part of his game, but with this leg injury, I'm not too concerned about it, like immobilizing him or anything like that. Even with that said, he should be totally fine moving around back there. Admittedly speaking, when JJ was coming out of college, I was not like the highest on him. Like, I thought he was a mid to late first round pick. And I think a lot of people probably saw him kind of close to how I did, just of course because of how important the quarterback position was and sort of the small little skill set that he had in college. But of course, when you're looking at quarterbacks, sometimes you're banking on upside, sometimes you're banking on the potential that player has. And I think that's what Minnesota was kind of doing with JJ, where yes, he's not a finished product now, or probably won't be a finished product for the next few years, but we're hoping 3-4 years down the line, we're talking about a quarterback who's potentially top 15, top 10 in the NFL. And I think the issue is for the Minnesota Vikings that potentially could hold them back these next few years is that I do believe that JJ needs 1 or 2 years of true development years, whereas this Vikings team kind of has to go all in like right now. Again, we'll kind of talk a bit more about that statement here in a little bit because I truly do believe they need to go all in like right now to win a championship, especially with this cheap contract that JJ McCarthy's on. It's just kind of a weird sort of timeline here where they need to win now, they have to go all in, but their quarterback might not be ready. Emphasis on might. We're not too sure about that quite yet. But the good news for JJ is that the roster surrounding him and the coaching staff surrounding him is freaking awesome. When you look at the offensive pieces around him, of course, probably the best receiver in the NFL in Justin Jefferson, one of the best wide receiver twos in the NFL in Jordan Addison. You also have guys like Jalen Naylor, as well as you also brought in Rondale Moore, who we'll see what he can ultimately do in this offense. Offensive line-wise was a very big issue last year. They dealt with some injuries, and the interior of that offensive line was really weak. So what did they do? Well, they added Will Fries, one of the best guards in the NFL, and Ryan Kelly, a little bit older of a player. I think he's 31, still a really awesome center in the league. So now I look at this offensive line. It's Christian Darrisaw. I'm assuming it's going to be Blake Brandel and then Ryan Kelly, Will Fries, and then opposite of Darrisaw will be O'Neal. I think this offensive line looks really solid on paper. Again, just got to stay healthy, and maybe I would like to see a bit more depth, maybe at like the left guard position. But overall, if they don't take anything on the offensive line, I have no issue. I think their starting five is fantastic, and JJ McCarthy should have plenty of space to operate along the offensive line. The running back room I thought was a big time need for them, but they kind of addressed both the right now as well as the future. Bringing back Aaron Jones on a new deal, I thought was a very smart move. I think Aaron Jones is a solid running back at this stage of his career. Probably not like a true every down back, but he is somebody who you can trust in the pass game. He can make a couple plays here and there in the running department. And I think 15-20 carries a game is about what you're going to see out of Aaron Jones at this stage. But you also did bring in Jordan Mason from San Francisco, who honestly looked really good last year. And now he's heading into a system that should be pretty similar to what he was running in San Francisco. And I just think Jordan Mason is just going to have a lot of space to operate behind this offensive line. I mean, San Francisco's O-line is not very good. This Minnesota offensive line, in theory, should be good. And so I think Jordan Addison should be prepared to have a really nice season. Could he end up taking over the RB1 role? We'll have to wait and see on that one. But as time does go on, it does look like at the bare minimum, they have a really, really good RB2. So I'm excited to see how this running game looks. It should look a lot different from last year because last year it was basically super dependent on Aaron Jones and whatever they could get from Ty Chandler. Whereas this year you kind of have three different options, and I think Jordan Mason is maybe the best of the three. So in totality, I look at this offense surrounding JJ McCarthy, and I think he has the necessary skill positions in running back, receiver, and tight end. I didn't even talk about TJ Hawkinson, but I also do think now more than ever, the offensive line is completely prepared to succeed. So if you're asking me, what do I think this Minnesota Vikings offense will look like in 2025? I think it's going to be one of the best offenses in the NFL, assuming JJ McCarthy does work out. I do think it will take some time. We'll have to kind of see how he adjusts to certain schemes and certain defensive looks. And so if he can adjust and if he does play well, I think this offense should be awesome. Last thing I'll say about the Vikings, I would not be surprised if they picked up a backup quarterback, because right now their backup is Brett Ripien or Brett Rapin. I'm sorry if I've said that wrong, but yeah, they could really use a backup quarterback, or maybe they draft like a Dylan Gabriel or something. But I think a veteran would really be nice in this quarterback room. If we scroll down over here down to the defense, this was a defense last year that was awesome, and I think this year they're still good, but I do have a couple more questions that I would like to have. We'll start off with the defensive line, which last year the edge rushers were fantastic. Jonathan Grenard was fantastic. Andrew Van Ginkel was fantastic. You got great play from your linebackers. Your front seven was pretty solid. It was just the interior that kind of lacked maybe some juice and maybe some veteran presence in there. But now you bring in Jonathan Allen, you bring in Javon Hargrave, who admittedly speaking have maybe been on the tail end of their career, but that's kind of fine for Minnesota. They don't really need either one of those guys to return to form. They just kind of need them to play to the best of their ability. We'll pair that with Harrison Phillips and some of the depth options behind them. I look at this interior of the defensive line with Jonathan Allen, Harrison Phillips, and Javon Hargrave, and I think it could be pretty good. And if you get like 50% of the Philadelphia version of Javon Hargrave or 50% of like Jonathan Allen from 2-3 years ago, then you'll probably take it because that's a really damn good player. Pair that up with a fantastic player like Jonathan Grenard and Van Ginkel, and your defensive line should have some really nice power to it. I will say, I think maybe another defensive tackle in like the late first, early second, third or fourth round, wherever you can really find it. I don't think it'd be the worst case scenario, because I think if maybe you could find a physical run stuffer who might give you a little bit of some juice in the pass rush game, would really be nice. So I'm looking at a guy like Alfred Collins, Shamar Turner, TJ West, some of those sort of guys later in the draft that I think would be solid fits for this Vikings team to just kind of add a bit more young depth in that defensive line room. My big question mark is now within the secondary, because the secondary is kind of different from last year. Obviously, you were able to retain Byron Murphy, which was nice. You're able to retain Harrison Smith. Josh Metellus is still in there at the strong safety spot. But now your cornerbacks are a little bit weaker. Now, I wouldn't say it was necessarily a strength for them last year. Like, Stephon Gilmore wasn't fantastic last year, but he was serviceable. But now I look at the corners, and you have Isaiah Rodgers, Jeff Okudah, Mekhi Blackman, Dwight McGlothern, maybe Najee Thompson gets some reps, as well as, of course, Byron Murphy in the nickel role. I guess he can also play on the outside if you need him to. I'm just not quite sold on the secondary, especially the cornerback room. I think safety-wise, Harrison Smith's still playing well. You also have Theo Jackson, and then Josh Metellus is more of a strong safety, is a good player. Not the greatest in coverage, but definitely can kind of just be a threat all over the defense, more of a weapon, more than just like a singular spot. He does so much for this team, but maybe you want to add a free safety in round 2, like, I don't know, a Kevin Winston and Andrew Makuba, somebody along those lines. And Malachi Starks in the first round would also make a ton of sense. I'm just a bit more concerned about the cornerbacks, because Isaiah Rodgers last year only played 329 snaps for the Eagles, and I thought he played good in those snaps. It's just that ideally like to see a little bit more. And outside of that, has never really been like a full-time starter. Like, he's kind of just been a rotating corner who's had good like PFF grades his whole career. I mean, he's been a solid corner. I just have concerns about him being like your true starting every single down outside corner. Now, we'll have to wait and see what the draft looks like, because right now I just think it's a bit of a question mark. Mekhi Blackman is also a question mark. Hasn't really played a whole bunch in his career. He did play a little bit in his rookie year in 2023 where he had some decent grades, but last year didn't play much at all. So that is a bit of a concern. I guess you're really hoping he can step into a bigger role in what is now year 3 for him. So I still think maybe adding another option there, like a Jahdae Barron if he falls to you, or Will Johnson if he falls to you. Maybe you look more in the second round for like an Azariah Thomas. Maybe you look for the dude from Notre Dame who I'm blanking on, you know, those sort of guys who might be a bit better options and a bit cheaper options in the second round. I think it could be worth your time to at least look at adding a cornerback to this room, because again, I just have some concerns about, can Mekhi Blackman, Isaiah Rodgers, and Jeff Okudah really hold down those outside corner spots. So let's get back to what the point of the video is. This is a team that has to go all in, and they kind of have done so far. JJ McCarthy's on a cheap deal. it is a lot easier to build a roster that's competitive when you have a quarterback on a cheap deal. Compare that to teams that don't have that luxury and now have to pay their quarterback $50-60 million while also having to somehow build a contender around them. Some teams are able to do it, like you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, who have been able to do that around Jalen Hurts, but Jalen Hurts kind of just got paid. But now you're starting to see teams like the Dallas Cowboys, who are really struggling to build a roster around Dak Prescott because Dak's like the highest paid quarterback in the league. Or eventually the 49ers, who are already kind of going through that, where they can't re-sign a bunch of players because they got to re-sign Brock Purdy to $40-50 million. So typically what you end up seeing is those teams that have high paid quarterbacks have to build through the draft, and unless you hit on every single pick, it's just very difficult to get it done. And you might say, well, the Kansas City Chiefs have a high-paid quarterback and they can build a roster around him. Yes, they have a high-paid quarterback, but it's a long-term deal. They signed it a few years ago, like a 10-year deal, and nowadays that contract is relatively cheap for his position. So now they're paying Patrick Mahomes a super cheap deal and able to build a contender around him because the contract's really affordable. Compare that to, of course, like a Dak Prescott deal or a Jalen Hurts deal. So if I am the Minnesota Vikings, I have, 2-3 more years left of JJ McCarthy on this cheap contract. I think you have to continue to be super aggressive, not only in free agency, but also the draft. Don't be afraid to spend extra picks to go out there and get a surefire hit of a player. Like, for example, if let's say in this year's draft, Will Johnson is falling to them, and let's say Will Johnson's available where the Cardinals are at. Maybe you start taking some phone calls and say, hey, can we potentially make a trade for a guy like Will Johnson so that way we have a superstar in our cornerback room on a cheap deal? So I think there has to be a level of aggression that is, of course, calculated and smart, not stupid, but just a sense of we got to get this thing done ASAP. Now, unfortunately for the Minnesota Vikings, they're playing in a conference that is really difficult, not to mention a division itself that is extremely difficult. And I see a lot of contenders in the NFC this year. I could just kind of go through the list right now. In terms of playoff contenders, we'll go division by division. NFC East, I think Philadelphia is probably a lock. I think Washington's also close to being a lock. Dallas could get in the conversation, but I'm a little skeptical on them. Of course, NFC North, you can make an argument for every single team. And yes, that does include the Bears. I am a believer in them. So you really can't count any of those teams out. NFC South, you're probably just looking at one team making the playoffs, and I'm probably betting my money on either Atlanta or Tampa Bay. But again, probably just one team there, maybe two, you'll never know. And then NFC West, the Rams, I would say, are probably a lock. And then you kind of have a debate there where can a team like San Francisco put it together again? Can a team like Seattle put it together, or one of those rosters out there? So I think there's a lot of teams pushing for that 7-team playoff spot, and that's really going to make things difficult for Minnesota. Hell, we saw last year Minnesota was a 13 or 14 win team and still did not get a first round bye because of course, how great the NFC North was last year, and that's probably going to be the case here again, where the NFC North is going to be stacked, and Minnesota's going to have to go up against them with a younger quarterback that doesn't have the same experience with Jared Goff. He doesn't even have the same experience as like a Caleb Williams, which is kind of crazy to say. So if you're asking me, do I think that the Minnesota Vikings will make the playoffs? I think right now it's a little too early to say. We'll have to kind of wait and see what JJ looks like during the preseason. We'll also have to wait and see what their draft looks like, because if they have a great draft and if JJ McCarthy looks good in camp and looks good in preseason, then I'll probably predict them to ultimately make the playoffs or make a deep run at this thing. It's just that every single year it's going to get harder and harder, and the pressure is going to continue to build for this team to build a contender around JJ McCarthy and truly go get from this being a good team to being a legit championship contender year in and year out. I want to believe in this team a little bit more than what I actually believe in them, just because I have big time question marks with this team. But if they play it out smart here in the draft, and if everything works out the way they think it will in terms of JJ McCarthy and his play, then I think this team can be really good. So I'll leave it at that. I think the Minnesota Vikings will be awesome next year, but they need to go all in, not just this year, but next year and the year after that, because this team needs to be a championship contender while JJ McCarthy is still very, very affordable. So you guys let me know in the comment section below, what are your thoughts on the Minnesota Vikings? Will they or will they not be making the playoffs this year? And who do you want them to draft if you're a Vikings fan? Let me know. And if you enjoyed, subscribe. Love you guys. Peace.